Hello and welcome to WION Live broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks and these are the headlines of this Tuesday. Voting is now underway in America's midterm elections, with Republicans chasing a congressional majority that would paralyze Joe Biden's agenda for the next 2 years. Kremlin-installed authorities in Ukraine's southern region of Kherson say power has been restored to its main city after blaming Kyiv for attacks that disrupted water and electricity supplies. India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar holds bilateral talks with Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. Jaishankar says buying Russian oil is to India's advantage and that New Delhi will continue purchasing it. President Xi Jinping says China will strengthen its military training and preparation for any war, as its security has been increasingly unstable and uncertain. And the United Nations warns of a worsening food crisis in bankrupt Sri Lanka and says the number of people needing urgent humanitarian help has now doubled to 3.4 million. Here in the United States, the big day has dawned. In-person voting is now underway in America's midterm elections. President Joe Biden says democracy itself is on the ballot today. Democrats are hoping to keep control of the House of Representatives and the Senate. But given the state of the economy and the precedents of political history here, the White House can expect to lose some ground at least in the House and possibly in the Senate as well. Biden and other Democratic Party campaigners, including former President Barack Obama, have insisted the future of democracy itself is at stake, given that so many Republican candidates today, more than 50% of them in several surveys, have embraced former President Donald Trump's entirely false claims that American elections are fraudulent. Opinion polls suggest we're in for a long process as the votes are counted. Most surveys indicate the Republicans can expect to take control of the House of Representatives, but the US Senate is on a knife edge, with several close races in key battleground states neck and neck. The entire House of Representatives is up for grabs today, along with 1/3 of the Senate and the keys to 36 governors' mansions all over the country. Losing control of one or both houses on Capitol Hill will dramatically restrict Biden's ability to advance his legislative agenda and could leave him a lame duck in the White House for what he hopes are the remaining 2 years of only his first term in office. He could still use executive orders to advance his plans, but they are limited in what they can achieve. A poor showing in the midterms will also raise fresh questions about whether Biden can seriously plan to run for the presidency again in 2 years' time. The president's last campaign rally took place yesterday in the state of Maryland.
You got one day until one of the most important elections. You've heard this time and again. I almost feel guilty repeating it. Our lifetimes are going to be shaped by what happens the next year to 3 years. It's going to shape what the next couple decades look like.
A solid display from Republicans today will give a huge boost to former President Donald Trump. He's endorsed scores of candidates in races all over the country and portrayed himself as the leader of the opposition in a country where that title does not formally exist. Despite there being no evidence of widespread voter fraud, Republicans all over the US have embraced the former president's conspiracy theories. In Ohio last night, the former president made it clearer than ever before that as soon as this election is over, he will launch a fresh bid to return to the Oval Office in 2024.
This is the year we're going to take back the House, we're going to take back the Senate, and we're going to take back America. And in 2024, most importantly, we are going to take back our magnificent White House. I'm going to be making a very big announcement on Tuesday, November 15th at Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida.
That announcement in Florida could come as counting is still underway to determine the results of closely fought contests in these midterm elections. And it's also a fresh challenge to the Department of Justice, widely reported to be considering bringing criminal charges against Trump for his role in the January the 6th uprising on Capitol Hill last year. Meanwhile, billionaire Tesla CEO and now Twitter owner Elon Musk is encouraging people to vote Republican. He has pinned the tweet that you are seeing on your screens. Musk qualified his recommendation by saying that shared power curbs the worst excesses of both parties. His appeal was directed to independent voters, and independent voter turnout could be the deciding factor during these midterm elections. Voter turnout in the US has been close to 60% for presidential elections in recent decades, but only around 45% during midterms. But there was massive early voting, and that suggested a larger than usual number by the time polling closes tonight. For more on all of this, I am very glad to be joined today by WION's North America correspondent Susan Tehrani, who is, of course, live for us in New York. So, Susan, an absolutely massive day unfolding across the United States as polls open, as the sun moves from the east to west. There's no guarantee that by this time tomorrow, we're fully going to know the outcome of these elections.
Absolutely. It is going to be a nail-biter of a night for sure, but you're correct that we are not going to possibly, most likely, not know the result of the elections. One reason for that is going to be Pennsylvania, which has been really a neck-and-neck race between, at least in the Senate, Mehmet Oz and the Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman at this point. And that's going to be, a swing state, a purple state that we're going to be watching. But then there are states, for example, like New Hampshire that we'll be watching closely. If earlier in the night a state like New Hampshire perhaps decides to turn red, at least in the, Senate section of the voting, then we might get sort of a picture of where things are heading, although we might not really have an answer. But as far as a clear-cut answer, we might even, brace ourselves for going all the way into December. Absolutely.
And Susan, if this is as close as we expect and we see recounts and possibly even the need for runoffs in some locations that could take weeks before they're held, I mean, given the prevailing political temperature in this country, that's going to be an absolute pressure cooker, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, in what you were just saying earlier, the level of polarization on the one hand, the distrust and mistrust, not only in the previous election cycle, the presidential election, but also really at a time when we're expecting more likely than not an announcement by former President Donald Trump. November 15th, that's not far away. It's about a week from now. And then you also have the results being up in the air for the midterm. A pressure cooker is perhaps the best way to describe the political climate, probably, if we don't know what's going to happen with the results of the midterm. But I think everyone is bracing themselves for that climate on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think the American people are also hoping that they'll get some kind of understanding again as the results come in for some of these states, which direction Washington is going to lean towards. But I think when it comes to the politics of it, when it comes to the media circus, for a lack of a better word, yes, we're in for a long haul for sure.
And a long night for sure. Susan Tehrani live for us on the streets of New York City today. Thanks very much indeed for that. Also joining us today, Raymond Vickery, a senior associate and Wadhwani chair in US-India policy studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Vickery, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the program today. America used to argue that its democracy was a shining beacon on the top of a hill that the rest of the world could emulate. It may well be that the events of the hours that lie ahead will once again suggest that America is in our rearview mirror.
Well, thanks very much for having me. What you say has some truth in it, in the sense that democracy really is on the ballot, and this is very important for the two greatest democracies in the world, the United States and India. There's so many things that the U.S. and India need to cooperate on: democratic values, rule of law, what happens with China, what happens in Ukraine, climate, and so forth. So it's very important for the relationship. I believe that thus far, and knock on wood, the U.S. democracy has stood the test. We stood the test in 2020, where people who were actually Trump appointees stood up and said, no, he lost. Now the question is whether or not we can maintain that integrity of elections. And as has been pointed out, this is a very attenuated and very difficult circumstance. But I have every hope that we're going to come through and be able to continue to work very closely with India in a democratic fashion.
And what's at stake in foreign policy terms in these elections, particularly as far as Southeast Asia is concerned? How much could change if the Republicans capture a majority, not just in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate as well?
Well, I think that you've already seen signs in the Republican House of Representative members that they are very wary of continuing support for Ukraine. They are not completely attentive to the kinds of incursions that China has in Arunachal Pradesh. The existential issue of climate change, you have a number of climate change deniers, certainly people who do not support the kind of movement that we need from fossil fuels to renewables. So that is very important. I think that in regard to matters which really touch many Indians who want to move back and forth between the United States and India, which both countries need, there are people who are anti-immigration across the board. So these kinds of issues will be impacted, but the basic and most important impact will be deadlock. If you have a House of Representatives and a Senate which are intent upon destroying Joe Biden and not attentive to these broader issues, that very much affects the well-being of the United States, of India, and indeed the entire world.
Raymond Vickery of the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being with us on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, as I said earlier, fascinated though we are by the outcome of the races in the House and the Senate, there are also some very important gubernatorial elections taking place all over the United States today, and they will seal the fate of a whole host of politicians and provide further insight into the mood of the country.
Competitive governors' contests are on the ballot in about a dozen states in Tuesday's U.S. midterm elections, with outcomes that could hold far-reaching consequences on issues like abortion and voting rights.
Truth and facts and logic and reason and basic decency are on the ballot.
From Pennsylvania to Arizona, Michigan, and New York, star power, money, and attention have flowed to the state-level races, typically overshadowed in midterm elections by the fight for control of Congress.
You know, they had a little rally here. Nobody showed up for their rally. Look at this rally.
In Pennsylvania, President Joe Biden and former Presidents Barack Obama and Donald Trump all made stops in the final weekend before Election Day. Republican Doug Mastriano and his Democratic rival Josh Shapiro each highlighted the impact of their race on the state's future.
On day one, woke is broke. That's right. CRT is done.
His number one priority is taking away a woman's freedom. And to do so with no exceptions, not for rape or incest, to save the life of the woman.
Abortion is also on the forefront in Wisconsin, where Democratic incumbent Governor Tony Evers faces a strong challenge from Republican construction magnate Tim Michels, who has promised to enforce a 19th century abortion ban that Evers is challenging in court. And Michigan's Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer has made abortion a focal point of her re-election campaign against Republican opponent, Trump-backed conservative commentator Tudor Dixon, who supports a near-total ban on abortion.
But make no mistake, all of this is at risk in this upcoming election.
Nominees in several states have embraced Trump's false claims that the 2020 election was stolen, and Republican victories in presidential battleground states could have implications for the 2024 presidential election. Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, a Democrat, has echoed that sentiment in her race against Republican Kari Lake, a former news anchor in one of the country's closest gubernatorial races. Lake has called for officials in charge of the 2020 election to be jailed. She is backed by Trump.
We had great times under President Trump, and we miss you so much, President Trump.
Nationwide, the majority of governors' races are safely in either Democratic or Republican hands. In Texas, Republican Governor Greg Abbott is expected to win a third term despite a lively campaign by his Democratic opponent, former U.S. Congressman Beto O'Rourke. Georgia's Republican Governor, Brian Kemp, also looks likely to prevail against Democratic challenger Stacey Abrams in a rematch of their 2018 race.
This is a man who's banned books, he's banned children, he's banned abortion, he's banned background checks, he's banned the truth, and it's time for us to ban him from the governor's office.
But in New York, Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul's lead in the polls over Republican challenger Lee Zeldin has shrunk to single digits as Zeldin has hammered away on the crime issue.
Hello, Oregon.
And in Oregon, a three-way race could result in a Republican winning the state's governorship for the first time in 40 years. Republicans currently hold 28 governor seats nationally, compared to 22 Democratic governors. In all, 36 of the country's 50 states will elect governors on Tuesday.
The outcome of today's elections here could have a big impact on foreign policy, and particularly with regard to the situation in Ukraine. Joe Biden has committed more than $50 billion in aid to Ukraine so far, among that $18 billion for the military sector alone. And just 4 days ago, Washington announced another $400 million worth of military assistance is on its way to Kyiv. The Pentagon is in talks with Germany over establishing a security headquarters in the country to oversee ties with the Ukrainian military and weapons transfers to Kyiv. But that was a decision green-lighted by a Congress headed by Democrats. If this midterm election changes the shape of Congress, Republicans are threatening to withhold rubber stamp approval for Joe Biden's seemingly limitless spending in Ukraine. Some have described Biden's assistance for the country as a blank cheque that should be curtailed, if not stopped completely. According to one poll carried out for the Wall Street Journal newspaper, 48% of Republicans say that the US is doing too much to help Ukraine. And a Senate vote in May saw 11 Republicans vote against the support package for Ukraine that was under consideration at the time. A Reuters poll indicates that 73% of Americans approve of continuing US support for Kyiv. If the House falls into Republican hands, Kevin McCarthy is expected to become Speaker and will play a key role in deciding what legislation comes to a vote. Many analysts here expect aid for Ukraine to continue, but to be cut back considerably. Ukraine's defense against Russia, of course, is heavily dependent on the US. In fact, one of the reasons Kyiv has made so many military gains lately is largely due to the shipments of advanced weaponry that it's received from the US and allied countries. But all of that is on the ballot today, along, of course, with everything else.
The question is unanswerable right now. It's hard to tell.
Virgin Group owner Richard Branson could face a lawsuit in the United States with charges including defrauding shareholders. A district court in the US has ruled that the billionaire entrepreneur must face shareholders' claims of hiding problems with the galactic spaceship Unity and selling stocks at inflated prices. The case has been brought by shareholders who owned Virgin stocks from July 2019 to October of last year. It also accuses the company of a cover-up when the rocket Unity was severely damaged during a test flight in 2019. In a 55-page decision, Judge Aline Ross says shareholders can sue Branson for over $300 million for selling stocks at inflated prices. According to the shareholders, they've incurred huge losses as shares are now trading more than 90% below their peak in February of last year. The court says Branson must also defend a July 2021 statement that his flight soared 50 miles above the Earth, though it strayed from its assigned airspace. 19-time Premier League champions Liverpool are on the block, put up for sale by current owners Fenway Sports Group. The Boston-based venture capitalists say they're open to fresh investment, but could also end up cashing in on the club's sustained success under Jurgen Klopp. FSG also owns American Major League Baseball team the Boston Red Sox and bought Liverpool for what now seems a bargain, £300 million or $450 million at the prevailing exchange rate back then. Liverpool are one of the legacy teams in English football, but were flirting with going into administration following the troubled ownership of George Gillett and Tom Hicks. The club is now conservatively valued at over $4 billion, which is a tenfold increase on the initial outlay. FSG have released a statement saying they have frequently received expressions of interest from third parties seeking to become shareholders in Liverpool. FSG has said before that under the right terms and conditions, we would consider new shareholders if it was in the best interests of Liverpool as a club. Turning the fortunes of the team around from a mid-table scrap to genuine title contenders has boosted that valuation, with FSG's appointment of Jurgen Klopp in 2015 considered by many to be a masterstroke. Liverpool ended a 30-year wait for a first top-flight title in 2020. This followed a sixth Champions League title the preceding season. Liverpool have qualified for the Champions League knockouts every year since the 2017-2018 season and reached 3 finals. The club was crowned FIFA World Club champions for the first time in 2019. The 2021-2022 season was the best ever, with Liverpool challenging for 4 trophies until the final day. FSG have run a tight ship at Liverpool and have always adhered to the financial fair play rules, but success on the pitch has not led to a loosening of the purse strings, and manager Klopp has repeatedly complained about the inability to compete with the likes of Manchester City and Chelsea, and now Newcastle United, who are either backed by sovereign wealth or by billionaires. The collapse of the European Super League last year seems to be a factor as well, with revenue streams from the Champions League no longer guaranteed. Reports suggest investment banks Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley have been sounded out to hunt for potential investors or owners. The forced sale of Chelsea earlier this year for over $3 billion has sent valuations of Premier League clubs soaring. Anfield has evolved into a modern-day stadium and the training centre is world-class. A global fan base plus increased focus on digital engagements could see Liverpool's eventual sale price go much higher than what is currently being suggested. Finally from us today, could Zoom, or the video platforms we've all been using since the pandemic, begin saving the cinema industry? The largest movie theatre chain in the world, AMC, is partnering with Zoom to allow people to video chat from the comfort of their local multiplexes. Beginning next year, 17 AMC venues across the United States will work with Zoom to facilitate conference calls between small, medium and large-sized groups in different locations. The two companies will also provide the equipment and will offer food and beverage services, a concierge and movie viewing for an extra cost. This is AMC's latest non-traditional move to keep their business alive. Other moves have included buying a 22% stake in a gold mine, pushing for AMC popcorn to be sold in retail stores, and creating a special stock dividend called APE for the retail investors who rallied around AMC and helped the company avoid bankruptcy during the pandemic. Will any of this save the silver screen? We'll keep an eye on it for you.
I can scan you in.
And that's all for this edition of WION Live broadcast from Washington, D.C. Tomorrow, the results as we have them at the time from America's US midterm elections. A day of history is underway here in the United States. I'm Simon Marks. I'll see you back here at the same time, same place tomorrow. But for all the US election news and all of your other global updates, stay with WION. World is One.
There are many other... this is right, Arab.